All right. Hello, everybody. Today I have my first part of my analysis and critique of Locke's second treatise of government. So, we've got two treatises of government and a letter concerning toleration. These are kind of Locke's most famous writings. We're going to be covering the second treatise. We're going to be mostly skipping the first one, and there's a very good reason for this. So, before we get started, let's talk about that. Why are we only talking about the second treatise? Well, the first treatise is actually a point-by-point refutation of a book called Patriarcha by Robert Filmer. It's worth noting that, yes, this was written in the late 1600s, early 1700s, and yes, it was, if it had been written today on the internet, it would be called a fisking of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. So yes, people still did that back then. Now, the main argument that Filmer makes is basically obsolete today. Patriarcha attempts to justify an obligation to obey kings, royalty, nobility, etc., from mostly biblical grounds. Locke takes a lot of time breaking this down point by point and explaining why there's a lot of unexamined assumptions in Filmer's, arguments. Basically, these lines that supposedly go all the way back to Adam, we don't actually have solid records of who was the firstborn son, who was the secondborn son, who was the thirdborn son, and even less so, we have no records at all of what Adam bequeathed to son A versus son B versus son C, etc. And so Filmer's whole argument is kind of one of those things that is it's of note historically, but we don't really think about anything. We kind of accept that biblical justification is not a way to choose political leaders at this point, or that if there is a biblical justification for leadership, it doesn't come from just declaring that someone is from a direct line of some particular forefather, but rather would have to come from some kind of organizational thing that exists in the present, right? The Vatican can elect the Pope, right? But they don't make the argument that the Pope is the closest living ancestor to Adam. These are two different things. And even more significantly, in modern times, government leadership is not really hereditary in pretty much any significant nation anymore, and it's not based on biblical justifications even when it is hereditary, right? There still are a few kings and hereditary leaders, but they're generally not basing their claims off of I am, in a direct descendant line from said biblical forefather. It's worth noting that what we have today is kind of a perversion of Lockeanism. Locke was trying to produce a justification for limited government based on some form of consent of the people. And this is in contrast to monarchy based on the will of God, which had its own significant problems. Basically, that the people were effectively subjugated, and they could only hope for a good king. Now, after Locke, we have the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who adapted the ideas of things like social contract and will of the people into more significant effects. I would argue that Rousseau's philosophy of government is basically a perversion of Locke's philosophy. It is a perversion of Locke's philosophy that converts Locke's attempt, and one of the things we're going to be examining is whether Locke was successful in describing a limited government. But what Rousseau basically did is he took some weasel words and he turned Locke's limited government into a totalitarian system where, if you're lucky, they choose not to enforce certain requirements on you, but you have no necessary right because you've already given yourself up to the social contract, which is, there's a million problems with social contract theory from a Rousseauian perspective. And Rousseau is worth rebutting, but that's not what we're going to be focusing on here. We're going to be looking at Locke's second treatise itself. We're going to be trying to examine it from a perspective of understanding what Locke was trying to set up, and we're going to be ignoring, stuff that people layered on afterwards to basically give themselves more political power. The second treatise, the one we're going to be covering in detail, is Locke's attempt to justify government, specifically some kind of limited government based on some form of consent of the people. We're going to see that those definitions are a little bit flaky in some places from Locke, and we're going to critique that as well. But it's worth noting that Locke was trying to create a third way between absolute monarchy or absolute totalitarianism and anarchy, right? So, the philosophical question for us to ask is, can a government, let's avoid calling it a state for the moment, can a government actually be limited? Are there characteristics of a government that can be made purely voluntary, or at least, if not like wholly voluntary, or at least follow some concept of voluntariness, which we can get into a little bit later? Or is it that once you give government certain powers, it will inevitably grow based on the fact that those powers incentivize the government to grow endlessly, in which case there is no real such thing as a non-totalitarian government. There's only a totalitarian government that chooses by its mercy to not, order you to do everything, but it claims that it could have the right to do that if it decided to do so. Another thing we're going to be looking for is places where Locke's conception of government fails to be limited on its own. And so with that, let's get into the actual book itself. The first chapter is the introduction, and it begins with a brief review of the result of Locke's first treatise. It's kind of here's what I said earlier, and this is what we concluded, and now we're going to move on from here. Locke concludes from the first treatise that political authority cannot come from God, therefore we need another source or justification for political power. He notes that there are various types of power, and that we have to be careful to distinguish or identify them properly. The power of a father over his sons, or the head of a family over the rest of his family, is not necessarily the same kind of power as that of a king over a group of people or a piece of land, or even like a democratically elected leader over his citizens. These types of power, equating them is going to get us stuck in a mire of confusing linguistics, basically, because we're trying to narrow down what we're looking at specifically as power that is kind of government-based, and not the same thing as power that is kind of based on, like long-standing social norms and stuff like that, such as like familial power, or even like the power of like a master over a servant or a master over a slave. He talks about political power, according to Locke, is the right to make laws with penalty of death, and all lesser penalty crimes also follow from that power to make laws with the penalty of death. And the reasoning behind this is actually kind of nuanced and interesting, right? The death penalty laws are implied by any law with smaller punishments because if a person who is, rightfully convicted of one of these lesser crimes decides to do so, he may offer up enough resistance that lethal force is required to counter it. It may be that person, perishes or not, but the political power that has decided that this person is guilty of this and guilty of crime X and therefore faces punishment Y needs to be able to arraign that person and arrest them without them saying, no, I'm out. The incentive structure created by such a system would simply be that someone would commit a crime and then immediately pop out of whatever system they're a part of, which basically makes it difficult which basically puts them back into a situation of the state of nature, right? Which is, kind of what this whole government thing is designed to avoid. It's another element of political power is the employment of force in the community to regulate or preserve property, to execute the laws, to defend against foreign invaders, and for what Locke states as the public good. Now, there's some problems with this, of course, right? Number one, there's no reason why all of these functions have to be handled by the same body. So already Locke is off to a bit of a weird start. He's associating certain things that don't necessarily need to be associated. It could be that, in some world that body A is responsible for internal policing and body B is responsible for defense against outside invaders. These two groups don't necessarily need to be able to have one be on top of the other, or even necessarily have them be associated with each other. They could be separate companies, separate security companies that work in different that work in different areas of security. The other flaw here that I'm noting is that Locke's use of the phrase "public good" might be irreparably vague. It raises a lot of questions. Like, number one, must each action by the government be approved by all? Is there a unanimity rule? I think that Locke would argue that a unanimity rule is unrealistically strict, right? That once the government exists and people have agreed to be subject to it to a certain degree, they've given some kind of consent, they've agreed to to delegate certain responsibilities to that body, that body gets to make those choices based on their perception of the public good. Now, the problem, of course, is that the question of what is the public good is notoriously vague and notoriously easy to twist around linguistically. They can say that the elevation of a certain particular social group is the public good because that social group has some relationship to the public, right? If everything is fully voluntary, right? If every decision that the government makes you get to say yes or no to, and then it does or doesn't affect you based on your choice, then there's no reason for there to be a state, a coercive state at all, right? That's simply, a body that does that is simply an advisory body that offers you potential solutions to any problem that you face that it gets handed, right? If nobody is bound to respect its decisions, then it is anarchy in a sense, right? It's just an advisory body that has no real physical power, and as Locke's defined, it doesn't have political power in that sense, because among the decisions that the government could make would be, yes, we have through a process that is well known and well understood, convicted you of the murder of this other person, and you can just say, no, I'm not guilty of that, and that's that. That would be a purely anarchic system, because there would be no body that has the authority to punish offenders, regardless of what process they chose to do that. There's no person who would say, well, there might be some person who would say, yeah, you got me, all right, I'm going to jail. But the fact that there's a lot of people who would just say, well, I don't care whether you convicted me or not, I'm going to defend myself and my property, regardless of whether or not I killed this other guy earlier. So it's important to note here that consent is one of those things that gets thrown around a lot, especially by really, really I don't know what the word is, but like really adamant, internet anarchists who are like, well, I didn't consent to this particular thing, and I didn't consent to this particular thing. And this is kind of the same argument that the convicted murderer would give. I mean, I'm not saying that they're necessarily on the same level, but, philosophically, they have this similar aspect to them that, in theory, you've agreed to be a part of this body, you've agreed to delegate, certain powers or certain associations to that body, and then when that body makes a decision, you claim not to be bound by it. But when that body makes a decision that you agree with, you assume that others should be bound by it. It can get very confusing here because you can contractually consent to something that doesn't 100%, serve your purposes all the time. An example that I like to use is like, if you think about like Netflix, right? you might be a subscriber to Netflix. You pay, what is it, like $15 a month or something like that. You might disapprove of a particular action of Netflix. Let's say that Netflix decided to license House MD, and you would prefer that they license Columbo. Well, your agreement, your membership with Netflix does not offer you, what do you call it, like a vote or deciding position on what series they license, right? And so, you don't. There are people who would say that, well, I don't consent to you licensing House MD. I only consent if you choose to license Columbo. The thing about Netflix membership, though, is that and it could be something else. It could be that Netflix decides to change their price from $15 a month to $16 a month. Again, that's something that hurts you, but what you're looking at as a subscriber is you're looking at the effects that a Netflix subscription has to you in totality. And so even though the deal is a little bit worse for you when they swap from $15 a month to $16 a month, or when they decide to pull out House MD instead of Columbo, you might still decide that your association with Netflix, which is voluntary, is still worth it, right? Basically, you're not on the margin of subscription. You're somewhere away from the margin. And Netflix is doing a good enough job that you're still willing to fork over the subscription fee to maintain your access to the shows that they're offering you. If, however, they decided to change their price from $15 a month to $50 a month, then there would be a lot more people who are marginal subscribers in that case and would say, well, I'm not going to pay that much for Netflix. I'm going to go find something else to do. Or maybe I'll buy DVDs or something. It'll be cheaper. And so one of the aspects of like this kind of consent is that your consent is assumed by your failure to secede from the system, whatever that system happens to be. The fact that you still continue to give Netflix the $16 a month means that, on balance, you're getting more out of Netflix, in your opinion, than you're losing, right? That's how voluntary exchange works. And that's one of the major mistakes that I think limited government people like Locke make, is that they fail to understand that unless the ability to decide in some situations that you wish to sever connections with this body, whatever it happens to be, turns a limited government into a totalitarian government by definition, because the government can basically choose to interpret its delegated powers more widely, more broadly, and you have no recourse if it decides to do that. And if you decide, well, I'm no longer interested in being a part of this, you're stuck. That's one of the things that I think is really important about any possibility of having something like a limited government, is that you have to be able to leave. If you're not allowed to leave, and if you're not allowed to take your property, then either what you thought was your property isn't your property, or you're basically saying that, yes, this group can kidnap people against their will, which again would be a totalitarian system, just one that happens to not attack every particular action of every particular person, as they wouldn't be able to. So the introduction, chapter 1, is kind of about what political power is. Again, we can see that there are some significant issues here, because Locke is assuming this kind of like horizontal or vertical integration of different things that the state does. And he's also kind of offering this public good justification for the action of government, which, as we've seen, can turn what effectively is a limited government into one that is interpreting its own powers and effectively limited by nothing but its, by its own, the finite ambitions of its members. So with this, we're going to move on to chapter 2, which is probably the most controversial chapter, the one that comes up the most. It's the most popularly controversial chapter of Locke's second treatise, is chapter 2 about the state of nature. And we're going to try to understand what Locke means by the state of nature, and we're going to try to figure out how much of that actually makes sense and is useful So, Locke's basic argument here is that in order to understand the origin of political power, we must understand the natural state of man. And these are the characteristics of the natural state of man that he posits. Number one, perfect freedom to order actions, to dispose of possessions within the bounds of the law of nature. Number two, no need to ask for leave or depend on the will of others. And number three, all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, meaning that there is no clear master class and no clear slave class. Now, for this, he states the law of nature, and what he refers to is a book series by a guy named Richard Hooker called Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. And there's a bunch of these books. This is all ancient stuff at this point as far as books go, so you can pick up free copies of it wherever you want. But at length, this reliance on Hooker's state of nature is kind of a weak link at this point because it depends on a specific conception of God. It's an ecclesiastical polity. If we look at Hooker's book for a while, what we understand are the following about the laws of nature. Number one, there exists some set of rules that God intends to govern human conduct. Number two, God has given us some of these rules, but not all of them. An example would be like the Ten Commandments, are laws that are parts of the laws of nature, laws that God intends man to regulate his conduct by, which were given directly by God, right? But he doesn't give us answers to everything. The purpose of our reason, of our rational thinking, is to look for and find these rules, and these rules are the law of nature. Hooker basically says that the correct rules are effectively self-evident once you realize what they are. That a person, once presented with one of these rules, if it is correct, can't really deny it. And the clearest example is basically a formulation of the golden rule, and Locke notes this too. Now, it's worth noting that the golden rule is pretty similar to the non-aggression principle. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is pretty similar to don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Of course, there are problems that come up here of determining what is their stuff and what is hurting people and what is not hurting people. Now, Locke continues along these lines and following along, and it's worth noting that again, this is kind of a weak link for the laws of nature to go from Hooker, exactly because he's dependent upon, a particular conception of God. Modern libertarian philosophers have tried to kind of sidestep that issue by trying to come up with like a rationally self-consistent set of rules, with the idea that a set of rules that is rationally self-consistent and universalizable forms, kind of the base laws of how humanity is supposed to act toward other human beings. The non-aggression principle is a great example of that. Anyway, if we go back to Locke, we're gonna have to kind of trudge through this law of nature thing for a little bit more, because there's a lot of assumptions about what the law of nature is that go into what Locke believes is the state of nature. Number one, mankind, all human beings, are God's property, and there are no innate hierarchies of man. That is to say, there's no obvious signifier on a person's, a mark on their hand that signifies, I am a member of the ruling class, or I am a member of the slave class, or I am a member of the merchant class. There's no direct way to tell this by just looking at a person. There are certainly social conventions that this person is the son of merchants, and therefore he was brought up learning the ways of merchants, and therefore he will be part of the merchant class, probably. But these things aren't innate. They aren't part of mankind's nature so much as they are part of mankind's conditioning, right? There's a strong undercurrent of tabula rasa behind Locke and Hooker, in that man is born without a lot of these social conventions drilled into him, and his upbringing would determine more closely how he's going to end up. If you took the son of merchants and raised him as a mechanic, he would be more likely to become a mechanic than he would be to stay a merchant. He would have no innate connection to merchantness, right? That's kind of what the tabula rasa that's the result of the tabula rasa as far as we're interested for laws of nature and state of nature. Now, in the state of nature, Locke says that there's this reciprocal jurisdiction. And what it means is that every man and every woman, right, has the power to execute on the law of nature in the state of nature. There is no natural jurisdiction. There's no natural magistrate. And so if you believe in the state of nature that this other person is a murderer, then you have the right to bring justice upon him because there's no one else to do so, right? That's so and there's also there's no clear way to determine, impartially, who is a criminal and who is not. A person could very easily accuse a person of being a murderer without evidence and then use that to drum up, a group of people to attack him. That's all stuff that can happen in the state of nature, according to Locke. Locke does not have this idyllic perspective on the state of nature that a lot of people attribute to him. I think most of that actually comes from Rousseau. It's kind of like another one of Rousseau's perversions is that man in the state of nature is in this kind of ideal state or idyllic state, and it's his institutions that corrupt him. This is not Locke's position. This is closer to Rousseau's position, and unfortunately, this has become they've kind of become intertwined. Rousseau did a really good job of turning Locke's stuff into something that made a lot less sense, but makes a lot more sense to politicians and the power hungry, which is the problem. So, another point that Locke notes is that the power to punish or force retribution on criminals is proportional to the transgression. That is to say that, he doesn't say it's equal, he says it's proportional. And so this is kind of one of those angels on the head of a pin argument that you get in a lot of libertarian circles sometimes, where it's like, well, let's say that Bob steals, an object from Sam. Sam has the right to get the object back, but the question is, is there any further retribution that Bob is liable for to Sam, right? And some people say, oh, well, factor of 2, factor of 3, basically equal plus, psychological damages. Some of these things are really concrete. Some of them are more like, well, we're going to have judges that figure this out and kind of apply a reasonable standard to these things. None of these things are like totally concrete. They're all a little bit like, maybe it's this. I don't know. People are going to have to figure it out. But the point is that it is proportional, right? Sam doesn't have the right to just, murder Bob necessarily if Bob just stole a small thing from him, right? But people who are murderers have taken something that cannot be returned is the other point that Locke makes. And, at some point, the transgressor, the person who is committing crimes against people and property, kind of abandons the rules of reason. He becomes a danger to mankind itself. He's a universal outlaw, basically. This is kind of the basis, the ability to punish people who kind of decide that they're not part of society is kind of the basis for how and why princes and states and other types of rulers can punish people to begin with. Basically, the people are delegating their powers to punish transgressors to the government. They're basically saying, we need a process that helps us determine in some kind of relatively fair and equitable way, whether someone has been, is responsible for, some tort that someone else is claiming. Sam has claimed that Bob has stolen his things. We're going to have a body that is outside of Bob and outside of Sam, but that they both agree to be a part of, just make a decision based on evidence, based on people's opinions, based on a jury, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to come down with a ruling that has to be binding on both Bob and Sam, right? If the ruling comes down that there is not enough evidence that Bob did steal from Sam, then Sam doesn't get to go and take random things from Bob. On the other hand, if that body decides that Bob is liable, then Bob is, bound to give up a certain amount of his property. And, ideally, some of that goes back to Sam. The difference between retributive and punitive justice is kind of vaguely discussed a little bit by Locke in this section. Because the question is, what is full restorative? What is fully restorative? If you lose something, if you lose the use of something for a week because it's been stolen, and then you get it back, how do you judge that week that you weren't able to use it? Assuming that you get it back in similar condition. These are all questions that have to be determined by people, by bodies that Locke would call a government. Locke notes. So one other point is that Locke notes that princes and states and other types of rulers only have jurisdiction over their subjects or their citizens and not strangers, right? A court in the United States cannot determine that a man in India has committed a crime. There has to be some other body that makes those determinations because the man in India hasn't agreed to be a part of that American court system. There's a little wavering on that later on in the book, but for now the simple notion is that this internal justice system is internal and doesn't go out and reach out and grab people from God knows where. One other point that Locke discusses is that seeking reparations from offenders is just. He's saying that if someone has stolen your property, if someone has destroyed your property, if someone has done something like that where the cost is finite and repairable, that at the bare minimum reparations in the form of returning the thing, bare minimum, is definitely just, and probably more than that, right? Because you've not just lost the thing you've lost the thing for a specific period of time where you might have used it, you might have done something with it, you might have invested it, something like that. Again, this is that angels on the head of a pin kind of argument. We need some kind of body to determine what that retribution is going to be, and you also kind of want these punishments to be a little bit more than the value of the object that was taken, because you want to disincentivize the violation of property by theft as much as possible. You don't want it to just be normal for someone to break into your garage and take your car and bring it back at the end of the day, and that doesn't create a good incentive structure, basically. Another point that Locke makes that I kind of hinted at earlier is that for justice to be served, a man cannot be the judge in his own case or cases. Self-bias is something that is unavoidable in cases that involve you. Like I said earlier, even Bob is probably going to say, "No, I swear I'm innocent," regardless of whether he's innocent or guilty. In actuality, if the court rules that he is, guilty, that's something that people can and will do, because the incentive is to throw up your hands and say, no, I didn't do anything. I'm totally not a bad guy, and please, mercy, etc. One of the points that he makes that's interesting is that in a system where there are these magistrates that make these decisions, where there's both restorative and punitive parts of the justice system, that the magistrates or some system above the magistrates can choose to pardon criminal penalties, punitive penalties, but not the reparations themselves. That he says that's specifically unjust. And so, it is not the business of the magistrate to say, yes, you stole this from him. However, yes, you stole this loaf of bread. Yes. And yes, you were starving at the time. And so we recognize that there was justification to you taking that loaf of bread right then, because you were going to die if you didn't, right? And so, yes, we are going to be gentle with the punitive aspects of your violation. We're not going to give you the, 1 week in jail for stealing a loaf of bread penalty. But what we are going to make sure that you do is we're going to make sure that you get that loaf of bread plus a little bit more back to the person to make him whole. The magistrate has no power to pardon the restorative part of justice, only the punitive part. That's another interesting point that Locke makes that I think is probably almost never noticed by people who are going through this. So the question is, and the question that a lot of people ask when they're talking about Locke is, well, who the hell is ever actually in the state of nature? And number one, Locke has an answer, And even if you don't think Locke's answer is good enough, there's actually, I think, a really good reason to at least consider the state of nature, and not to just throw it out and say we must have this system, and kind of end up in a circular pathway that way. Okay. Number one, Locke says that all existing heads of state, are in a state of nature with respect to each other. That is to say that, Joe Biden is in the state of nature with regard to Justin Trudeau, right? There is no body above them to determine, that Joe Biden stole Justin Trudeau's soup, right? These things all have to be handled without reference to some particular body that both Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau offer their subservience to, right? The point that Locke is at pains to make here is that entering into a government with other people, into this kind of managed community, abolishes the state of nature. And so, Americans are not in the state of nature with each other, and Canadians are not within the state of nature to each other. But it can be the case that in the lack of an existing agreement between America and Canada, that an American could be in effectively the state of nature to a Canadian. The only thing that prevents them from coming to blows might be the distance between them. That's one of the points that Locke kind of tries to make here. Again, this is not an idyllic state of nature that a lot of people claim that Locke is promoting here. Yes, Hobbes was extremely warlike in his description of the state of nature, and and I think overly warlike, right? It is not 100% true that if there was a tribe of people, kind of living their lives out, and they saw an outsider, that they would immediately attack him. There are some tribes that would, and there are some tribes that wouldn't. It's incorrect to force that violent, stance on every primitive society when it encounters an outsider. At the same time, it is not true that mankind is in some idyllic, beautiful state when he's not in the state when he's in the state of nature. In fact, there's no way to determine in any kind of objective or fair or just method who the criminals are. And so really the rights that you have are the rights that you can defend right now, and everybody has to sleep, right? That's kind of the state of nature that Locke is arguing that Locke is arguing for our classification, and not some kind of idyllic state, and also not some kind of obvious war state. People in the state of nature can certainly go to war with each other in the sense that they decide they're going to kill each other. Locke would argue that violates the laws of nature, but that there's no one to judge them for that, except for other people who are also in the state of nature, and they don't have to necessarily have someone up top who says, yes, this guy's right and this guy's wrong, so let's support him. Everybody can make that argument for themselves, and this is messy. It's extremely messy, and it's extremely dangerous, and your rights are only protected for the 16 hours a day that you're awake. And that's why Locke proposes that people join communities, join these governed systems, to give themselves a little bit more control over what rights they are able to exercise, what property they are able to hold on to, things like that. And this is the really important point of Locke, is that again, there's going to be kind of iffy bits here and there, but on balance, the idea behind a Lockean government is that being a member of the government is better than not being a member of any government. And that's why people join them. They're joining them because on balance, they're gaining for it. Just like you might subscribe to Netflix, even though you wish they were charging $3 less a month. And so it's important to note that this state of nature situation is even if there aren't very many people who have ever been in the state of nature, right? Because mankind did not grow up, as isolated individuals. Even people who are in even people who were in communities had to examine their options vis-a-vis the possibility of leaving the community, right? If you had a tribe and the strongest person, the best hunter in the tribe, like if we think about like the most basic form of civilization, right? Basically a group of people who, everybody goes out and hunts every day. And like, let's say 80% of them come back with an animal. And it's not sure who is the people who came back with animals this day, and they're not really like stepping on each other's toes. They all go off in different directions. Well, it's better to hand over a little bit of your food, which is going to spoil anyway, to someone who didn't get an animal that day, so that later on, when you don't get an animal that day, they give you food back. Kind of like Anthony de Jassé refers to it as like a potlatch, right? There are reasons why you would join this community, but there are also reasons why you would look, especially if you were like the top producer. Let's say you always get an animal. You might say, well, why am I giving up my food to this guy who, only gets an animal 60% of the time? Maybe I'd be better off by myself. And so the state of nature as an intellectual exercise is very important. Much like in economics, the evenly rotating economy is something that we think about, even though no one's ever going to reach the evenly rotating economy. We have to look at it to see what alternatives it offers to the situation we're in. In the same way, the state of nature is something that we examine as a question of why are we in the association that we're in and not choosing a state of nature? Well, the obvious reason would be that we look at the state of nature as a possibility and say, I like this better. I like it better being a member of the tribe. It's easier. I don't have to guard my stuff, when I'm sleeping, right? And so even if very few people have ever actually experienced the state of nature, it's important to understand what it would look like, so that we understand the alternative that people in these societies are looking at, especially in primitive mankind. Because it could be that, some guy, some chieftain of some tribe is saying, yes, you are the best hunter that we have, but we're going to take stuff from you every time. And there may be some straw that breaks that camel's back. And the guy says, you know what, screw it. I'm out. I'm going to be my own chief. I'm leaving the tribe, and I'm going to have to deal with that situation. That would be a person returning to the state of nature, unless and until he gathers a group of people and they agree to enter into some kind of covenant, with different rules that they find more attractive than the ones that they were under with the, hypothetical tyrannical chieftain. So, to summarize, we are covering the second treatise because the first treatise is basically a fisking of a book that is about the justification for kings based on biblical justifications. That's not particularly useful these days. Nobody really believes that anymore, and almost nobody is trying to bring that back. Nobody cares. Not nobody cares about, but nobody honestly takes the principles of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha and says we should organize society that way. That's practically zero people. Locke's second treatise is his attempt to justify a form of limited government somewhere between what he viewed as totalitarianism, an absolute king with the will of God behind him, and anarchy, where everybody is just on their own. The question that we have to ask now is, how well does Locke achieve his idea of limited government? Is what he's proposing actually going to limit itself? And we're seeing that already he's making some definitions that are kind of troubling, right? He's connecting a lot of different bodies, horizontally or vertically, and saying that, well, the government must do all of these things, when in fact the government might not have to do all of these things together. It might be that different organizations handle certain things. He also uses this public good language, which is extremely slippery, as we've seen, and people will use it to justify basically any kind of power grab that they want. We then look at Locke's conception of the state of nature, and we observe that it's not the idealistic situation that Rousseau teaches us, and that a lot of people claim is what Locke was believing. And yet at the same time, it's not necessarily as warlike as what Hobbes was talking about. There can be people who are independent of tribes that meet and trade. That might actually happen sometimes. It's not a guarantee, right? people who there's no system of magistrates to determine who is a criminal in the state of nature, and therefore, you are constantly at the potentially prey for these criminals who are living in the state of nature with you. Therefore, in order to make it so that you are more likely to survive, in order to make it so that you're better able to defend your property when you're sleeping, you enter into a community with people in order to kind of consolidate that self-defense and and make a system that improves your situation as opposed to one that you feel enslaved by, right? That's what Locke is trying to avoid, is the idea of a legitimate government basically enslaving its people. Such a government that claims totalitarian powers cannot be legitimate in a Lockean framework. We note that Locke's conception of natural law is colored by his citation of Richard Hooker's books of the laws of ecclesiastical polity. We observe that the ecclesiastical portion is a little bit outdated by our current conceptions of how this kind of stuff should work. But at the same time, we get something out of it that, the golden rule, which is pretty similar to what libertarians put forward as like the non-aggression principle or the zero aggression principle. We note that in the state of nature, it's kind of a weird thing because it is true that very few people ever actually enter the state of nature. Most people are born into a small community, and they never leave that community. Right? This is what primitive man was like. However, paying attention to what the state of nature is like is worth understanding from an intellectual perspective in the same way that various other simplified, say, economic models are worth understanding. You have to look at the situation that you're in, and then you have to think about the alternative. And the goal is for you to explain why the situation that you're in is an improvement to the alternative that you could choose hypothetically. This is another reason why Locke is promoting limited and not totalitarian government, because practically anyone who saw himself as a slave would choose to leave the organization that he believes he is enslaved by. It's very important to understand that the state of nature is or at least was an alternative back when mankind was so sparsely distributed that a person could leave his tribe and walk off in some direction and not meet anybody for a long time. Could kind of eke out a living by himself and maybe even trade occasionally with other people or with other tribes. This is a thing that happened to some people, but more importantly than that, it is an example of an alternative that people who are in these situations had to consider as to whether it's better than or worse than the situation they're in. And this is the kind of consideration that makes Lockean consent. You say, yes, I don't like some of the things that my community decides for me, but at the same time, my alternative is the state of nature, and I think that's worse than what I'm currently in. That's the goal of Lockean government, is to produce a system where everybody believes that the system that they're in is an improvement to the state of nature, basically. Or, a membership in a different similar organization. So yeah. It's worth noting that Locke actually says that his conception of the state of nature is a strange thing. That it's not something that like a lot of people experienced. It's one of these things where people who are trying to break down notions of limited government are very quick to say, well, no, there's no archaeological records that anybody was ever alone like this, that any significant number of people were alone like this out in the wilds. People generally grew up in, family-based tribal situations early on. But the point of the state of nature is the intellectual exercise. Is my situation better than what it would be if I left it? And that's the stepping stone that Locke is going to use to make his definition of what consent means for people who are under a government, under a state, a limited state, hypothetically. And why the state must be limited, because an unlimited state is by definition a slave, enslaving people. And people would naturally prefer non-enslavement to enslavement under most circumstances. So, yeah, that's the first two chapters, I guess. Yeah, first two chapters of the second treatise. Next up we have, if I can get my thing work, Chapter 3 is about the state of war, and Chapter 4 is about slavery. We'll probably cover both of those. And we might even cover Chapter 5 in the next section, which would be of property. Because the property one is pretty long. Maybe we'll give that its own... Oh, that is long. Well, we'll figure it out. Anyway, Chapters 1 and 2 of Locke's second treatise. Hopefully this has been at least a little bit thought-provoking. It's important to remember that Locke is not saying that the state of nature is an idyllic thing. That's the main takeaway that I want people to remember from this. Because, I see people, making these arguments that like, oh, the state of nature is irrelevant and Hobbes had it right because, the limited government perception of the state of nature is this beautiful idyllic thing. And I really don't get that perspective from actually reading Locke. I really think that's something that was tacked on later by people like Rousseau, who are trying to kind of create this idyllic perspective of what primitive mankind was like, in order to justify giving them control over institutions, in order to force mankind to be free, right? So it's one of those things that is a kind of pet peeve of mine, is that like, well, the state of nature is irrelevant, and even if it were relevant, it's more Hobbesian than Lockean. Whereas I think Locke actually gets a lot more nuanced in his perception of what the state of nature is than Hobbes did. It's the problem that we have people taking Locke's perspective and kind of slapping this whitewashed coat of paint on it that makes everything seem happy and magical when people didn't have governments. Whereas Locke's perspective on it is not that. Basically he says, yeah, you have all the rights that you want as long as you can protect them yourself. And guess what? You can't. That's the thing, right? Yeah, there's no person who's there to say, oh yeah, he committed a crime against you. He's got to give this stuff to you. There's no person to do that. Therefore, whatever you can keep, is yours. And there's no higher authority to say, oh yeah, he wronged you, get your stuff back. It's not nearly as nice and happy as a lot of people would have you believe. And that's the justification that Locke wants to use to leverage into his idea of limited government. Because he doesn't want to go to totalitarian government. Again, people would prefer not being, he's assuming that people would prefer not to be slaves to being slaves in most cases. And so he's trying to come up with this third way between anarchy, pure anarchy, and totalitarian government. And that's what this book is about. That's his effort. Limited government. And, partially successful, but not wholly successful. As we can see, it is something that is capable of being perverted by people like, by power-hungry people like followers of Rousseau. So we're going to get more into that next time. As for now, I will say thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This is a really complicated topic because, I did go back and I read the first treatise, earlier, and I read a bunch of Richard Hooker's of the laws of ecclesiastical polity. I'm trying my best to kind of not just explain what Locke thinks, but also explain what's troubling about what Locke thinks, and also explain how Locke is often misunderstood. That's kind of my effort for this. So yeah, thanks again. And if you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you next time. This takes a lot longer than I thought too. I think I promised to have this out 2 weeks ago, but it just was Anyway, see y'all later. Have a good week. For me, it's Tuesday before Thanksgiving, so hopefully y'all have a fine Thanksgiving and a good long weekend, and see you soon.